reading another ghost story from the book Ghost Stories by A.L. Furman. Today I am reading Valley of No Return by Willis Lindquist. The mountain slope lay green and sweet with the smells of spring. It seemed to please the tired sheep. 2 weeks on the mountain trails had made them thin, but they were grazing contentedly now, as if they sensed that their summer grazing grounds had been reached at last. The 2 Navajo boys hardly had time to notice their sheep. They looked in awe at a mountain pass about a mile away. "That must be the entrance to the Valley of No Return," Yellow Hand told his young brother, Little Deer. "It doesn't look like much. I'm not afraid. Are you?" Little Deer's eyes were very wide. He kept staring at the opening between the great red cliffs, remembering all the frightening Navajo legends about the valley. Finally, he looked up at Yellow Hand. "They say those who go in never come out," he whispered. "What happens to them? How can a whole flock of sheep disappear?" Yellow Hand tried to laugh, but it did not sound like a laugh. "It's just some old Navajo superstition. Who ever heard of a valley that could swallow up herders and whole flocks of sheep?" "All of us have heard it many times," Little Deer said. "It must be true. Grandfather said none of our people have dared to enter the valley for many years." "Just superstition," Yellow Hand repeated. "At school they say every superstition has a simple explanation." Though Little Deer, too, had heard all about silly superstitions at school, he looked down at his feet and did not try to hide his uneasiness. "It is not good to live so near that evil place," he said. "Where else could we find so much good grass?" Yellow Hand asked. During their 2 weeks on the trail with their sheep and their 3 calico ponies, they had seen nothing nearly so good as this lush green slope. He looked up toward the mountains where the last spring snow still lingered on the sunny peaks. Far below them lay the brown sweep of the desert and red buttes standing like monuments to the time when the world was young. "I don't like it," Little Deer said. "Look down there. That is the ledge Grandfather told us about, the place where the ancient ones of our people lie buried. Maybe this place is haunted." Yellow Hand frowned. With good grazing land so hard to find these days, it did seem strange that this fine slope of grass was not being used, but he could not allow his young brother to see that he was puzzled. He said, "You ought to be glad we found such a fine place. There is good soil for our corn. And look over there," he pointed. "People have lived here before. There is a hogan. It looks good enough to live in. Grandfather said there were 3 cisterns here for water. The ancient ones drilled them out of solid rock, so they will last forever." Leading their ponies, the boys approached the Navajo house. It was round and built out of stone and clay. As they entered, they saw the roof had caved in a little, making the smoke hole in the center larger than it should have been. "Look," Little Deer's voice caught. "Cooking pots, old clothes, and rotten old sheep belts. Those who lived here must have left very suddenly, or something very bad happened to them." Even Yellow Hand felt a chill brush up his spine. He did not like the look of this place, but he tried to be casual. "Old pots, junk, throw it all out. This place will do fine for the summer." As he spoke, he edged over until his foot covered the perfect circle someone had scratched in the earthen floor. According to Navajo tradition, a closed circle without a break in it for evil to drain out bad sign, a curse. Someone had put it there as a warning. Yellowhand was glad Little Deer had not noticed it. The moment Little Deer went out with an armful of rubbish, he rubbed the sign away with a stick. He was responsible for his little brother ever since their mother and father had been lost in the big snow 3 years ago. Their grandfather had looked after their flock of sheep. But now he was ill. He had sent them out for the summer to make them strong so that they could take their place with the men of the tribe and earn their own living. It was a test Yellowhand could not afford to fail, for failure would bring shame and sadness to his grandfather. As Yellowhand looked over the place and examined the cisterns chipped out of solid rock, he wondered what strange thing had happened here. What had happened to the people who lived here a couple of years ago? Was there any real danger, or had they been frightened off by some ancient and foolish superstition? Little Deer came up behind him so quietly that Yellowhand almost jumped at the sound of his brother's breathing. "Why do you sneak up behind me that way?" he scolded. "We don't have time for any of your kid games." "I wasn't sneaking up," Little Deer said. "I just figured out what happened to the people who were here. They must have taken their sheep into the Valley of No Return and just disappeared." "Well, we don't have to take our sheep over there, so there's nothing to worry about." But Yellowhand knew the explanation wasn't as simple as that, because it did not explain the warning circle drawn on the floor of the hogan. He was glad the cisterns had been left covered with a mat of branches. There was hardly any dirt in them at all. He was also glad that nothing unusual happened for several weeks. They built brush corrals in which to keep their sheep and horses at night. With canvas buckets they filled the stone cisterns with water from the little mountain streams. Then the ewes began dropping their lambs as the slope became bright with spring flowers. As if by agreement, neither of them mentioned the mysterious Valley of No Return, nor did they venture near it. After the lambing period, the sheep had to be shorn. That was hard work. For want of wool soap, Yellowhand dug roots of the yucca cactus, pounded and soaked the roots. The milky water in which they had soaked washed the new wool white as bleached bones. Then the corn had to be put in. It was planted when the cornbird, the yellow-shouldered blackbird, came from the south, according to ancient Navajo tradition. But all was not well. The spring rains they had been expecting did not come. Streams dwindled to trickles, then became dry washes on the mountainside. Day after day they looked for rain clouds in vain. Soon they were forced to ration their precious cistern water. "From now on we have to let the sheep out to graze before sunrise so they can lick the dew from the grass," said Yellowhand, "and we'll only give them water from the cisterns every other day. We have to make the water last until we have more rain." But he knew the water was not going to last very long with 60 head of sheep and 3 horses and 2 boys drinking it. The worst of it was that it was almost too late now for heavy spring rains to fall, and ahead of them stretched the normal summer dry season. A feeling of hopelessness swept over him. Upon the slope with his flock one afternoon, Yellowhand was startled by a sound. 3 times it came, the hoot of an owl in broad daylight. In spite of himself, he felt the tightening in his stomach. The hoot of an owl was said to bring bad luck. 3 hoots, according to his grandfather, meant a dire warning. He told himself this was merely another Navajo superstition. But superstitions lived with from childhood, he found, were not so easily put aside. During the next few days, for some reason he could not explain, he kept glancing up the slope time and again. It didn't make sense. as they drove their sheep into the brush corral. This place is evil, he said, his voice trembling. It watches. It waits. It has eyes. We are never alone. For a moment, Yellowhand started at his brother. So Little Deer felt it too. Then it wasn't merely his imagination. There was something dark, something frightening about this place that evoked an unknown fear. To calm his small brother, he said, "Perhaps you don't like the space, the stillness here." He looked out over the vast desert. The amber light of the setting sun touched the buds, changing them into frozen flame against blue distance. "We are valley people. That is the trouble. We'll get used to this bigness." Little Deer refused to listen to that kind of talk. "I think Grandfather was right. This place is haunted. I hear sounds. Something moved there among the rocks today." He pointed downslope at the shelf where the ancient ones were buried. The tightness came into Yellowhand's stomach again. Could the place really be haunted? Was that why the others had left so suddenly? Why they had scratched a closed circle on the floor of the hogan? "I don't want to stay here any longer," Little Deer said. "Please, Yellowhand, take me home." "If we went home now, our sheep would die on the way, and everyone would laugh at us and say we were afraid of the dark. Grandfather would be so ashamed he would not find words to say to us for many days. When Grandfather said this place was haunted, he meant to test our courage." Yellowhand walked away before his brother could answer him. They could not go back. That was impossible. But their corn had withered and died as it came from the ground. Now the grass was turning brown on the slopes. All his wonderful dreams for a good summer were fading to nothing. If rain did not come within a week, their water would be gone and their sheep would die. His sleep was troubled that night. Once he sat up with a start, suddenly alert. He saw the embers of their fire glowing softly beyond the doorway. Some sixth sense told him they were not alone. Yet he heard nothing but the small sounds from the sheep corral and the deep, steady breathing of his younger brother. Carefully he rose, picked up his rifle, and inched toward the open door. There was no moon, only the bright stars. Not a breath of air stirred. It was so still that the silence of the night seemed to press against him. For several minutes he watched and listened, then moved slowly to the corral and the cisterns. As he came around the hogan on his way back, he stumbled against something. His fingers touched the familiar framework of his saddle, and his breath caught. The saddle had been moved. Someone or something had been here. It was the kind of senseless thing that was supposed to happen in haunted places. He took up a position near the door and huddled there, waiting and watching till dawn touched the eastern sky with tints of gold. Later, in the bright morning sunlight, he thought he saw the faint imprint of a moccasin near the loom. Armed with his rifle, he took his flock down the slope to the ancient burial grounds. If Little Deer had seen movement down there, it might be possible to find tracks. He found many. They were all as they came. They narrowly missed the Hogan. On they came, straight at him and the sheep. The sheep broke into a run. Just in time, he drove them aside, and the rocks went thudding harmlessly by. The sudden attack left him breathless and hollow inside. Someone had tried to kill him, or at least to drive him away. He was relieved to see Little Deer come on the run. "Stay with the sheep," he gasped. Quickly he told his young brother what he had discovered. "The grave robber must have seen me come down here and knew I'd see him work. He'll kill us if he can to keep us from reporting his crimes." He waved his rifle toward the shelf where the rocks had started. "I'm going up there." He walked westward along the slope. It would be hard to surprise the grave robber, but he had to get the man quickly before he could strike again. He dropped into a dry ravine which concealed him from view and followed it straight up the slope. Well over an hour had passed before he reached the ledge. There were fresh tracks and places where rocks had been wedged loose. With his rifle at ready, he searched behind every projection where a man might hide, but found nothing. The man was gone. The distant report of a shot drew him to the edge of the shelf. He looked down the empty slope. Little Deer and the sheep were nowhere in sight. To the left, his eyes caught a movement. It was a smudge of dust such as a flock of sheep would raise. It was moving steadily toward the valley of no return. For once, Yellow Hand was willing to believe in the terrible dangers of the mysterious valley. He bounded down the slope at an angle to get ahead of them. The grave robber had outsmarted him and struck again. This time he meant to dispose of Little Deer, who was unarmed, and the sheep, by driving them into the valley. It soon became apparent to Yellow Hand that he would be much too late to head them off, but if he had a horse, his chance would be improved. Sliding down a draft of shale, he made for the corral. Long minutes passed before he had the warmth of horse flesh under him. Then flying hoofs beat out a rhythm that kept pace with his heart. He shuddered to think of the terrible things that might happen to Little Deer if he lost this race. His horse galloped on, quartering the slope, plunging into ravines and out again, with Yellow Hand hunched low over the pony's neck. But their speed was not enough. When they came within sight of the valley's entrance, only a haze of ascending golden dust hung between the sheer umber cliffs. Little Deer and the sheep had already passed beyond to an unknown doom. A shot rang out as he started between the cliffs. His pony reared in fright. Yellow Hand pitched headlong into the dust. He rolled, made a grab for his rifle, and dashed for cover as a bullet keened over his head. The shots were coming from a crevice halfway up the cliff, and ahead he caught a glimpse of sheep as they went up the valley. In desperation, he shouted for Little Deer to turn them back. Piercing laughter answered him from the cliff. The crevice in which the man was hiding made perfect cover, so long as Yellow Hand faced it at an angle. But it would become a death trap if he could reach a position in front of it and shoot in. He worked deeper into the valley entrance by diving from rock to rock. Every move he made drew the grave robber's fire. Bullets began whipping dangerously close as the man learned to anticipate his every move, until at last even the slightest feint brought a shot or two. The man was becoming desperate, using a lot of ammunition. That was all to the good, but precious minutes were passing. If Little Deer and the sheep were to be saved, there wasn't much time left, probably only seconds. Yellow Hand looked ahead for another rock behind which he could take cover, but there were no more rocks, Perspiration rolled down his face as he raised himself enough for a peek at the crevice where the man was hiding. To his surprise, he found he could almost look into it now. And stranger still, the man was not shooting. Had he run out of ammunition? Then he saw the man trying to scale an almost vertical wall. As Yellowhand watched in horror, he knew the man wasn't going to make it. He heard the scream, saw the man's body wheel into space, and come plunging down to death on the rocks below. Yellowhand, suddenly free, ran at top speed up the valley. It seemed to be empty. He saw nothing but the vast rock walls looming in eternal silence. His shouts brought no answer. The broad trail of the flock led him to a yawning cavern in the upper end of the valley. There several lambs had been trampled to death as the sheep had struggled to enter the cavern. For the space of several seconds, Yellowhand stood rooted, too stunned to move. Waves of numbness passed over him. He had come too late. The ancient stories were true. The evil valley had swallowed his brother, his flock of sheep, all that counted. Slowly, like one in a daze, he entered the cavern. He felt a cool flow of air in his face, and the air had the smell of water. Suddenly he understood the terrible secret of the valley. Only the smell of water could have made sheep struggle so desperately to enter. He knew how Little Deer must have tried to get in front of them to turn them back, how the sheer weight of their numbers had forced him in. Yellowhand made a torch, lighted it, and again entered the darkness of the cavern. Here several more sheep had been trampled, and the flock surged toward water. The underground tunnel turned left after several yards, and suddenly Yellowhand came to a sheer drop of 5 or 6 feet. Little Deer and the flock had fallen into the rushing black water directly below, and the underground river had carried them off. Staring at the black water, Yellowhand felt the tears gathering in his eyes. But suddenly he heard something that made his pulse quicken. Dropping to his knees, he listened intently. The sounds were unmistakable now. Above the rumbling of the river, he could hear the clear, sweet tinkle of bells and the faint bleating of sheep. And the miracle of it was that the sounds were coming from upstream. Yellowhand lost no time in dropping into the rushing water. It was only ankle deep. Thanks to the dry season, the river was low and the sheep had not been swept to their death. They were going upstream toward the fresh flow of air, and Little Deer was sure to be with them. How long he followed the river tunnel he did not know. It seemed endless, but always ahead he could hear the faint sounds of the sheep. Now the smell of growing things came on the flowing air, and at last he saw the dim light of day up ahead. He came out into a sunny valley completely surrounded by mountains. There was a sparkling blue lake in the center, which fed the river. On all sides were fresh green slopes where his sheep were grazing. Little Deer came running, his face masked with fear. That man! You don't have to worry about him. He won't be troubling us anymore. Yellowhand looked up at the high pine slopes. He saw a pass in the mountains through which they could come and go. He laughed and raised his arms wide. All ours, Little Deer. In our secret valley we'll have food and water as long as we live. Are we going to bring Grandfather here when he gets well? Yes, Yellowhand said. Grandfather will see us as men now. He'll be glad to come. After all, this valley belongs to him too. If he hadn't sent us out for the summer to test us in his old-fashioned way, we would never have found this place at all. Little Deer smiled. And if he begins talking about is the end of Valley of No Return by Willis Lindquist. Thank you for watching or listening